Well, good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. We're on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. We can also be heard streamed online at www.saga960am.ca. And you can get all my videocasts and podcasts on my website, briancrombie.com. So I've had a couple of different interviews with people that have been taking a look at cannabis and medical marijuana, both for COVID-19 as well as cancer and a bunch of other things. And a friend of mine mentioned that he was taking a look at psychedelics. And so I thought, wow, be fascinating to understand a little bit about that. So I'd like to introduce you to Larry Zeifman, who is a owner of an accounting firm in the Toronto area, and his son, Richard Zeifman, who's a PhD student, and he's actually doing his research into psychedelics. Larry and Richard, how are you?
Doing well. Nice to be here, Brian. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for joining me. So, Richard, tell me, why psychedelics?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Psychedelics are pharmacological agents that have a range of effects on the mind. The name psychedelic actually comes from the idea that they're mind-manifesting drugs. There was early research being done in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that showed really promising results for the treatment of a range of mental health problems. That research was actually shut down, mostly for in the context of political issues surrounding drug use in the 60s. And it really put a hold on research into using psychedelics within the context of mental health. So some of the main reasons to relook at these are both because of the profound effects that psychedelics have on human consciousness, and also the preliminary results so far that do seem to suggest that psychedelics seem to be fairly beneficial for treatment of a number of mental health conditions that can be quite difficult to treat.
Such as?
So the main one that it's been used for over the last 10 years, I'd say, is anxiety and distress associated with a life-threatening illness. So these are people that get cancer diagnosis often that suggest that they may not have that much time left to live, and that will often trigger intense distress, difficulty coping with that. And the truth is that we don't really have any interventions, certainly not pharmacological interventions, that are highly effective for treating that. So that's one of the main areas, and the research there has been quite promising. Another more recent area is in the treatment of depression. So there's a small study looking at people with treatment-resistant depression. So those are people who have tried a number of pharmacological interventions, often a first-line antidepressant, and haven't found that it works for them. And the results so far looking at depression and treatment-resistant depression seem quite promising. So still early on, but the results so far that we have suggest that there might be some really promising effects in the context of treatment of depression.
Fascinating. Now, Richard, tell me a little bit about yourself. What's your background? I presume science, but how did you get to doing a PhD? What's the PhD in, and why did you choose psychedelics as the area to focus on?
Sure. So yeah, I'm doing a PhD in clinical psychology at Ryerson University. And so what I'm doing is a combination of both doing research and doing clinical work. And one of the reasons I took an interest in psychedelics is that, there's been a lot of growth in the field of mental health. We have a lot of interventions that are quite effective for a lot of conditions. But at the same time, those interventions aren't effective for everyone. There's a lot of people who you might treat with those interventions that don't see improvement, or if they do see improvement, it doesn't work quite as well as you'd like. So it came with an interest in identifying how do we improve the interventions that we already have. How do we grow in that field in the sense of being able to offer better treatments to people? And then seeing the kind of research that was done earlier on in the 60s and the kind of growing promise around it suggested to me that it might be an interesting area to go into. I think psychedelics offer an interesting avenue for intervention in contrast to other pharmacological interventions because of how they work. So whereas with an antidepressant, the kind of effect that you're getting is more of a suppressing of a symptom. What a psychedelic does is it really opens up what's going on for somebody and might have the potential to help actually facilitate the therapeutic process. So you're really looking to, instead of mask or tamp down a symptom, you're really looking to do some kind of healing or kind of deep work that might be helpful in the long run.
Fascinating. And Larry, You told me that you're actually either investing in this area and or advising people that are investing in this area, and it's an opportunity for growing companies. Is that true?
That's true. I mean, most of the work I'm doing is actually on the audit side. We've been doing a lot of work in the cannabis space, and some of those entrepreneurs have now moved into the psychedelic space. And coincidence of my worlds colliding, and I've been talking to Rick about this for years. And now I have the opportunity to have, like George said on Seinfeld, his worlds collide, right? So I'm seeing what I'm doing in my professional career, and I'm able to interact that with my son's career and tap his knowledge so that I understand the space. So it's mostly mostly audit clients who are active in the space. They need audits because they're planning on going public. It's become a very, very active space in the corporate finance world. There have been a few transactions done already, and in the pipeline, there's a whole bunch more. So, we're active in that area, and it's a great opportunity.
We're chatting about psychedelics tonight with Richard Zeifman and Larry Zeifman. We're going to take a break for some messages. Stay with us, and we'll be right back. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're having an interesting conversation about a topic I was sort of surprised to have raised to me, and we're talking psychedelics. Richard Zeifman is a PhD student studying psychedelics, and Larry Zeifman is a audit partner, owns an audit firm that is helping some psychedelic companies companies studying psychedelics to go public. So fascinating. So Richard, psychedelics, when you say psychedelics, I think LSD. So what are psychedelics that you're studying?
Yeah, so earlier on, the primary psychedelic that was studied was LSD. Now, the majority of the research is in psilocybin, which is chemical that comes out of what are called magic mushrooms. There's also some research into what's called ayahuasca, which is a traditional Amazonian brew. So I'd say the main ones that are being researched are psilocybin, LSD, and ayahuasca.
And how do you get access to these drugs? I thought they were all illegal.
Yeah, so in most places, these are what you might consider Schedule I drugs. So very complicated to kind of get your hands on. Under certain constraints, you can get approval from the government to be able to do research. It's quite a lengthy process, and accessing the chemicals can be quite expensive, actually. But it is possible to do under very specific constraints, wherein if you do have the chemicals, they are either under lock and key in a safe. It's a complicated process to get approval, but it is possible to do.
Now, the typical pharmaceutical process is you have to do a phase 1 study in healthy humans, and then a phase 2 study where you're showing efficacy, and then a phase 3 study where you're showing efficacy in a very large group. Do you have to go through the same sort of process?
Yeah, you do. So phase 1 studies have been done, and phase 2 studies have been done for a few different drugs. So phase 2 studies for it's not a traditional psychedelic, but often is used under that label is MDMA. So phase 2 studies were done for using MDMA in the treatment of PTSD. And now there's a large multi-site study for phase 3 investigating MDMA as a treatment for PTSD. And there have been a number of phase 2 type studies for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, with additional phase 3 studies currently underway.
So let's come back to, let's start with the treatment-resistant depression. I used to be involved in the pharmaceutical industry, and there are some, as you say, antidepressants, first-line antidepressants that have a suppressive impact on the depression, and then other ones, and the best one, an SNRI called Wellbutrin, had more of an upper, which sounds more like what you're talking about from a psychedelic standpoint. And what they found was that people that really just sort of needed a lot more energy, focus, because they ended up getting depressed, were far better off on a Wellbutrin, on an SNRI, than an SSRI. which would be the Celexas, the citalopram's, Prozacs, etc. Does that sort of coincide with why you're saying the psychedelics might be helpful for resistant antidepressant people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are different the SSRIs and SNRIs are kind of the traditional ways of treating depression, at least pharmacologically, and they do have their own kind of unique profile. One of the main differences between SSRIs and psychedelics is in the specific receptor. So they're both serotonin agonists, but with psychedelics, you're actually getting a specific subtype, which is the 5-HT2A receptor, whereas traditional antidepressants work on the 5-HT1A. One of the main differences, I'd say, between the types of intervention is that for traditional antidepressants, it's something that you have to continually take. So if you're taking an SNRI and you stop taking it, the effects of it generally tend to wash away. So you need to do called maintenance dosing. The difference with the psychedelic is that the intervention is brief in comparison. So you're typically doing 1 to 3 administrations of psilocybin in combination with psychotherapy. That could be anywhere from 8 to 12 sessions. And that's kind of it. Now, it might be possible that after months or years, you might have to do additional sessions. But the model, the way that the treatment is done is quite different in the sense that the research suggests that the effects last well beyond the time when the drug is in the individual system, with the idea being that there's some kind of process that's happening while people are under the influence of the psychedelic that's healing and that's helpful. And that stays with them in the months or years after the intervention itself is completed.
You mentioned serotonin. Can you explain what that and maybe dopamine are?
Sure. So those are there's receptors in the brain. So we know that the brain is made of different chemical receptors. Serotonin is one that's highly prevalent throughout the brain. And when treating depression, the majority of interventions look to target the serotonin system. A lot of the different interventions do it differently, but serotonin is something that's quite associated with the regulation of mood. So how you're kind of feeling from one moment to another. Dopamine tends to not be targeted as much by antidepressants, but sometimes you can have off-stream effects from an antidepressant on dopamine. But when you're looking to target something like depression, for the most part, traditional interventions are looking to alter the activity of the serotonin system.
And are you involved in a psychedelic study at Ryerson right now?
Yeah, so I do research at Ryerson, but I also collaborate with a team in London. So with the team at Ryerson, our main interest is using MDMA to treat PTSD. So there, what we're doing is there's some good evidence showing that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy works for the treatment of PTSD, and there's also strong evidence that there are certain psychotherapeutic interventions also work. So what we're looking to do is to combine these evidence-based therapeutic packages with MDMA to see if it makes these kind of frontline therapeutic interventions even more effective. With the team in London, at Imperial College London, there's the Center for Psychedelic Research, and we just completed a study comparing escitalopram, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor or kind of classic antidepressant, with psilocybin. So that study was just completed, and there's another study that's getting started where they're using psilocybin therapy to treat anorexia as well.
And any early results?
The results haven't been published yet, but they seem to be promising.
Really? So better than citalopram?
So I'm gonna hold off until that study is published to actually say better or worse. But I would say that the results themselves are promising, and I think will be quite interesting to the field.
Fascinating. And just out of interest, what is the research question for your thesis?
Sure. So psychedelics seem to have this kind of broad range of applications. So there's a number of mental health conditions that they seem to be helpful for. There's evidence for PTSD, for substance use, for depression and anxiety. So my primary interest is, how do psychedelics work? What is the process by which they lead to this long-lasting mental health benefit? And I can tell you a little bit about the specific mechanism that I'm quite interested in, but I could also leave that for another time.
Well, maybe we'll come back and chat about it in a minute or two. So, Larry, if I'm interested in this space, because it's fascinating, you're saying that you're aware of some companies. Are they all private, or are any of them public yet?
No, a couple have gone public already. None of our clients are public yet, but a couple are in the process. So there's a company called Champignon Brands, which is in the obviously in the mushroom space, and there's MindMed, which is got a fair bit of play because Kevin O'Leary and is involved with that company, as is Bruce Linton.
And what's MindMed doing? Mushrooms as well?
Psilocybin as well, yeah.
Excellent. And so these are both public companies already?
They are.
And how has the stock done?
I haven't looked at the last couple of days, so
okay. And are they micro cap, or are they actually on the big board?
I think they raised. I can't remember exactly. I think MindMed raised about 50 million was their goal. So we're not talking large plays at this point yet.
Okay, and then you're also advising You're also advising some private companies.
Yeah. So there's a few companies in the pipeline who are already in discussions with the exchange, and usually CSE, and working with brokers. So they're mostly still in the private tranche phase, but planning on transactions over the next few months.
And can you mention any of their names and what areas they're involved in? Is it mushrooms or LSD or something else?
They're mostly also psilocybin. So one that's gotten some press because they just signed a deal, I don't mind mentioning them, they just signed a deal for their RTO, is Cybin Corp.
SIB?
CYBIN.
CYBEN. Okay.
BIN, yeah, Cybin.
BIN. Cybin Corp. And so going public by way of an RTO into a CPC sometime in the next short while?
In no CPC, going public into through an RTO, shortly. So it's they filed their listing document with the CSE. They've done their deal. They're advanced stage of doing their deal with on the RTO, and they'll probably be public in the next few weeks.
I'll have to go check out their prospectus and see how they describe this industry. It'll be fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting to be at the ground floor. I mean, we're right at the beginning of this space, and it's very, very interesting. And the most interesting thing is, like Rick was saying, the opportunity to improve lives by bringing products to market that are going to do that. And as capitalists, we don't mind being involved in that through the capital markets. So
so compare this, if you could, to the cannabis space and the cannabis investment. So Canada was at the forefront of cannabis companies going public. Legalization obviously played a fairly major role in that, and the stocks took off, and then they've gone the other way. What do you think is going to happen with the psychedelic area?
So, we can't say for sure, but I think that the people coming into the psychedelic space are determined not to perhaps make the same mistakes that some of the cannabis companies did. It's really a different space, because what really projected the cannabis growth was the recreational market. And with very few exceptions, most of the psychedelics companies are really focused on the pharma side. That's really what's driving most of the activity in the capital markets. So they expect pharma players to come into this space to buy up some of these companies as the science proves itself, and I think that they're determined not, as I say, not to make perhaps the same mistakes. I think, and there's a lot fewer companies. There's no question. Today, what are there? 250 public cannabis companies. As for Canada's role in it, I think we're going to see a similar play. I think that Canada was very fortunate to be the epicenter of cannabis finance, and still is. That happened primarily because of Canada was an early adopter in terms of legalization, especially on the recreational side, but even on the medical side, because it had implemented medical cannabis opportunities years before. And I think that what's driving, even though Canada isn't necessarily ahead of any other country, and it's behind some countries in terms of legalization of psychedelics, because of the cannabis experience, and because of the role cannabis finance plays in the Canadian market, and vice versa, I think that's what's driving Canada being a leading player in the psychedelic space. So, and the fact that the Canada had a well-developed small cap type capital markets system, primarily based on the extractive industries, drove and fed Canada's role in the cannabis space, which in turn is feeding Canada's role in the psychedelic space.
So in the cannabis space, there were some American companies involved in cannabis that actually came to Toronto to get to get their financing and go public. Do you think that's going to happen in psychedelics as well?
I do. Yeah. Yeah, it's
Are
a
you
funny
seeing that
thing.
already?
You have companies that have virtually no operations in Canada at all, and we have clients like that who are listed in Canada and owned by Canadian companies at the top. That some of that is driven by the Securities Commission's positions on the legality, so that won't be as much of an impediment. But just the following the Canadian companies are getting in the cannabis space is driving that as well in the psychedelic space. Are we seeing it yet? Most of these companies are still at the research stage, so a lot of them are doing a lot of their research in the U.S. So yeah, I guess their presence in Canada may be temporary.
Richard, I've done a bunch of interviews with people that are developing vaccines for COVID-19, and they say the biggest challenge they have is getting volunteers for their clinical trials. I guess you've got no problem getting healthy volunteers for your trials. Is that true?
It's definitely easier. The safety profile of psychedelics are quite good. It's possible for people to sometimes have a challenging or a difficult experience, but for the most part, it's something that people are interested in. Lots of times there's lots of emails for people, both because they are perhaps desperate for some kind of treatment, and also because it's something that they've heard about or something that they have some interest in the experience. So I'd say it's probably a lot easier than with vaccines for COVID-19. It's still sometimes difficult to recruit people just because of the when you're doing getting a treatment in the context of research, it's a little there's more to it. You have to be willing to volunteer your time in certain ways, but there are people who are interested in it, and there's kind of less concern about the negative effects that I imagine might go into concern about being part of a vaccine trial.
We're chatting tonight with Richard Zeifman and Larry Zeifman. Richard is a PhD student studying psychedelics, and Larry Zeifman is a owner of an audit firm that is advising and auditing a bunch of companies in the psychedelic space. We're going to take a quick break for messages. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. We're chatting tonight with Richard Zeifman and Larry Zeifman. Richard is a PhD student studying the use of psychedelics in depression, PTSD, and other areas. And Larry Zeifman, his dad, interesting enough, is a audit partner, owns his own audit firm, and is advising a bunch of different people from an audit standpoint, going public in their audits, et cetera, in the psychedelic space, and has previously been in the cannabis space. Richard, let's go in a little bit more detail if we could. So PTSD, how would a psychedelic help someone with PTSD? And what is someone with PTSD taking? What's sort of the standard of care for someone with PTSD now?
Sure. So for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, there are two kind of frontline interventions that they might get. They might get a pharmacological intervention, often similar to depression and SSRI. And there we see that they are effective to some extent, but there's a lot of people that they're not effective for. They require you to keep taking the drug. And they don't, although they work to some extent, it's kind of that same thing of masking the symptoms. The PTSD doesn't exactly necessarily go away, at least for a lot of people. The other frontline intervention, which is usually generally recommended before pharmacological intervention, are psychotherapies. So those are therapies where you're looking to shift from avoiding or running away from the traumatic experience to really trying to process it. Either exposure therapy, where people are revisiting the traumatic experience, and they're trying to get more in touch with their emotional response to it, or something called cognitive processing therapy, where you're looking to identify how is a person thinking about the traumatic experience that maybe is unhelpful. So those are the current frontline interventions. They tend to work for a good number of people.
Hold on a second. So what was this term, cognitive processing therapy?
Cognitive processing therapy, yeah.
Which is what?
It's like a cognitive behavioral therapy for people with PTSD. So it's a psychotherapeutic intervention, usually about 12 sessions. And basically what you're doing is you're going in with the person to try to see if they could identify what are the ways that they're thinking about the traumatic experience that are, so to speak, keeping them stuck, feeling those intense emotions, whether it's fear or anxiety related to the traumatic experience. So with PTSD, what you get is there's a highly traumatic event, and there's a difficulty processing that event, or there's a way of thinking about that event that keeps a person either re-experiencing or relating to that event in a way that's unhelpful. So
okay, so what you're saying is that the SSRI masks the depression, and this cognitive therapy helps you process it and try to figure out why you're feeling that way, and sort of cures you of that depression.
Exactly. Yeah. And it works in the sense of a cure for a lot of people, probably about 50 to 60% of people that get the treatment. But there are a lot of people that don't necessarily get that effect.
Okay. And so now, how would psychedelics help you process it?
Sure. So MDMA is the primary drug that's been used for treatment of PTSD. And MDMA is kind of a perfect drug in some ways for the treatment of PTSD, wherein the primary symptoms associated with PTSD are avoidance of the traumatic memories, thoughts related to the memories, or the emotion related to it. So people are kind of stuck in this place of these memories or these emotions are coming back to them. And because they're so distressing, people with PTSD are trying to push them away. Now, what MDMA does is it reduces the extent to which people are experiencing fear. So it damps down a region of the brain associated with fear called the amygdala, and it allows people to be comfortable enough to be able to sit with those emotions, those memories, to almost re-experience them, or allow themselves to be open to those experiences so that they can then reprocess them. And you might think of it as every time a memory comes up, the context in which we experience that memory affects the memory when it goes back. So when people are under the influence of MDMA and they have a sense of calm or a sense of connectedness to their therapist, or a sense of being willing to visit difficult places, that allows them to actually sit with that traumatic experience or the memories associated with it, so that it can be changed or processed in a way that's helpful.
So it sounds to me like the MDMA the psychedelic would help in that processing, but you still got to go through the cognitive therapy if you're going to actually deal with that memory and try to process it. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the most of the research that has been done hasn't actually used cognitive therapy. That's a study that we're doing where we're combining these. The research that has been done has used what's called a non-directive approach. So basically, people are coming in, they're doing a number of preparation sessions where they're both preparing for what the experience under MDMA might be like. They're also talking about the traumatic experience to get them kind of primed and ready to be open to dealing with it. And then they're having 2 to 3 sessions where they're under the influence of MDMA. And while they're under the influence of MDMA, I'd say about 50% of the time, they might spend engaging with their therapist, doing that kind of processing. And 50% of the time might be them just going kind of internal. So sometimes the medication itself can kind of help to facilitate somebody doing that kind of processing on their own. But it is done in combination with a psychotherapeutic intervention. So we're not thinking about it the same way as an SSRI, where you just give it to somebody and that's it. It really, what matters is when you give it to them, what experience do they have while they're under the influence of the drug.
Which sort of makes sense, so that I can understand how it would be helpful in PTSD. If you did have that traumatic experience and you've got to process it, but then explain to me how it could be also helpful for depression, because I presume depression is, you're not depressed because of a traumatic experience that you have to process. It's because of some other chemical imbalance. Is that correct, or am I wrong there?
Yeah, no, that's correct. For depression, there hasn't been research using MDMA, but there has been research using psilocybin. The way that it works, I think we're still trying to figure that out. One of the ways we might think about it is that what happens with a lot of mental health conditions, and certainly with depression, is that people get stuck in a certain pattern, a certain way of relating to the world, a way of relating to their own experiences, and a way of relating to others that can be quite closed off. So people might be engaging in a lot of rumination, there might be a lot of disconnection, there might be this negative thought pattern that people are using in terms of their engagement with the world. And what psilocybin seems to do is to give you a pause from those automatic kind of rigid patterns of behaviors of the mind. So for that about 6 to 8 hours, those kind of rigid patterns break down, and it's almost like a kind of reset or a refresh are the words that people have used to describe it. So it gives you a break from that pattern, and then you almost get a sense of a new way or an alternative way of relating to your experience.
So the cognitive therapy for someone with PTSD will have a lasting impact if you've actually processed things. What you're saying is here with depression, there's some sort of a reset that you somehow, put that depression behind you?
Yeah, so a reset is one analogy. That's actually something that people that were in a trial with psilocybin, they use that. I wouldn't say a reset in the sense that you just give the drug and that automatically resets. What it seems to do is to help to facilitate a certain process, a process where people have the potential to relate to their experience in a different way. One specific way that we've started to look at it is that for people with depression, in a certain way similar to PTSD, there's this tendency to want to run away from difficult emotions, to suppress them or tamp them down. And what a psychedelic seems to do is to teach people to accept their negative experiences or accept their negative emotion, and be more open to those difficult experiences, which in turn may help them to feel better after the experience.
Now, some people have argued for recreational use or non-medical use of psychedelics as a way of sort of thinking things through in a far more in-depth manner. Have you looked at that at all? Are you supportive of that at all? Or no, you think it's only good for these medical issues you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's not an area that I've looked into. There are people who look at, who do naturalistic research, basically where people are taking it in non-clinical context. And they have seemed to find some interesting results in terms of creativity, also just in terms of mood and well-being. I'd say it's something that's quite interesting. I think it's important to not get ahead of the data. So that research is still quite early on. So I'd say I'm interested and open in seeing where that goes. But I'm not sure exactly what model is going to make the most sense. I think the most conservative model is one where we have these substances available only in the sense of a clinical context. But it could be possible that we'll have, so long as we're providing people with the appropriate training so that they're not using the substances in kind of harmful contexts, that maybe it might make sense for these substances to be available beyond their clinical use.
I interviewed two fascinating professors from the University of Lethbridge that were studying the use of cannabis for cancer, lung and breast and brain cancer, as well as they just initiated a bunch of work studying it for COVID-19. And it was interesting because they were saying that too many people from the medical standpoint were only focused on the CBD, and they thought that some amount of THC was critically important, and that the psychotic benefits of the THC had been sort of negatively portrayed in the medical community, and that that was a very positive part of dealing with pain, dealing with depression, dealing with inflammation, etc. Does that make any sense to you?
It does, yeah. Cannabis is not an area that I do research in, but it does make sense that these are, with cannabis, it's a complex compound, and it's likely that different elements of it will have different effects that may be helpful.
What they were suggesting, go ahead.
I think it's interesting that Rick is talking about how we have to wait for the science in order to apply opportunities, to make opportunities available for psychedelics on the recreational side, but the science hasn't really been there on the cannabis side. In cannabis, it hasn't really been there in cannabis on the medical side necessarily, and yet legalization has happened. And there are trends in psychedelics such as microdosing, things like that. I'm wondering if there is a possibility that that psychedelics will open up on the recreational side before the science is there, in the same way that cannabis has.
You're wondering, do you think it will?
I'm interested to hear what Rick has to say. I think that I think there's fear in the space amongst the regulators that there wasn't on the cannabis side, but maybe it'll be driven by the cannabis experience. I think there are similarities. It'll be interesting to watch. Maybe Rick, do you want to speak to the microdosing and some of the clinical studies on that front?
Sure. So microdosing is a practice where people take a very small amount of psychedelics, usually every 2 or 3 days. And people have said or have reported that they find it very helpful both for creativity, for well-being, for depression. There's very little data on it, and there's currently studies being done that will be really interesting to speak to that. But that is a different context in which people use it, out of not in the context of therapy, but more just, you might say, recreationally, or maybe just more as a kind of mood or creativity enhancing method. But the truth is that we don't know much about it, so we don't know if it is effective. I'll speak a little bit to the idea of the recreational side. I think there is concern, or there is worry that maybe to some extent, in contrast with cannabis, one thing that really contributes toward what the experience is under a psychedelic is the context in which it's taken. So most of the research that's been done does it in a very controlled setting where you're preparing people before, you're screening people out for certain reasons. So I think that one of the reasons why people might be concerned is that we don't necessarily know what would happen. And depending on your political orientation, you might be more open to the idea of, so long as we know that these aren't substances that cause serious physical harm, we should permit them. But I think it's a hard question to answer, and I think there's a lot of weight from the political movements in the 60s against use of recreational substances.
One other psychedelic we haven't mentioned is ketamine. Do you want to tell us what ketamine is and where it's being used today?
Sure. So ketamine is traditionally used as a tranquilizer. It's an NMDA antagonist, so its pharmacological properties are a little bit different than traditional psychedelics, but it seems to have some similarities in terms of what the experience is like when you're under the influence of it. The interesting thing about ketamine is that it's not a Schedule I drug, so available to practitioners to be able to use. So one of the interesting things that's happened is that in this space where there seems to be this promise, there are with psychedelics, but physicians aren't able to use psilocybin. Some people have been using ketamine to treat depression and suicidality. And there's pretty strong research suggesting that at least in the short term, few days to weeks, ketamine shows support for being an effective treatment for depression and for suicidality.
Fascinating conversation we're having tonight with Richard Zeifman and Larry Zeifman about psychedelics. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with a PhD student sorry, Richard, it was psychology or?
Psychology, yeah.
Clinical psychology, I think you mentioned. Richard Zeifman, yeah. and unbelievably smart numbers guy, Larry Zeifman, who is helping to advise some companies from an audit standpoint that are in the cannabis space and lots of other areas, as well as in the psychedelic space. Richard, let's just go back to a couple of questions that we talked about during the break. So ketamine, I had understood it was the date rape drug. You don't think it is the date rape drug?
I'm at least not familiar with its use in that context or being referred to as that. It's certainly possible that that's a thing, but not as far as I'm aware.
Okay, and I had also heard that it was very addictive. What's your sense of whether it's addictive or not?
Yeah, so in contrast with classic psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, one of the concerns with it is that it does have the potential for addictive qualities. There's also the potential for certain physical harm, like it can have a negative effect on the bladder. So I think one of the people are somewhat concerned about using ketamine as a treatment, both because it seems like in order for the effects of it to last, you have to do repeated administration, say maybe every couple weeks or something like that. So there are concerns about ketamine and its addictive quality. In contrast with ketamine, classic psychedelics like psilocybin have a fairly strong safety profile. So very low risk of abuse or of addiction, good physiological safety. And interestingly, while it can be used too much, so it doesn't have addictive qualities because it doesn't have impact that system that you mentioned earlier, the dopamine system. And interestingly, is being used or tested as an intervention for substance use. So there's been some research suggesting that it's helpful for nicotine use disorder. So people who are, for smoking. So some strong preliminary data suggesting that it's highly effective for people smoking cigarettes. And also some early research suggesting that that it's effective in the context of alcohol use disorder. And there's other studies being done now looking at its use in the context of cocaine use disorder as well.
Well, it's interesting because, well, Wellbutrin, which I had mentioned earlier, that was this SNRI, I can always get them confused, but that increases dopamine, also was dosed as Zyban for smoking cessation and for anorexia and some other things that are sort of issues that aren't necessarily mainline depression, but are associated with addictive personalities. When do you think you're going to get your PhD?
The plan is in the next year and a half.
Well, when you publish, we'd love to have you back to hear more about your findings. If you get any of the results from these studies that you say are being done right now versus citalopram in London, we'd love to hear more about that. And if you hear any of these studies of the recreational use coming out and you want to talk about that, that might be a fascinating follow-up. Larry, if people are interested in this space, from an investment standpoint, what do you think they should be doing? Should they be checking out this Cybin company that you mentioned, or is there going to be a group for psychedelics on the Toronto Stock Exchange, or what?
Well, I don't think there will be on the TSE, but there's likely to be on the CSE. There's a few companies on the CSE already. I think that anybody who's interested should do their research, and they should speak to their broker, this invest, but invest cautiously. these are interesting times. I think there's real opportunity, and I think as a capitalist, I'm delighted to see these sorts of opportunities, especially in a way that they can improve well-being on the part of people who clearly need it.
And maybe the leading research analyst that's going to be analyzing all those companies is going to be your son, Richard Zeifman.
Could be.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, fascinating conversation about psychedelics tonight on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour with Larry Zeifman from Zeifman. What is it? Zeifman Associates or something like that?
Zeifman's LLP.
Zeifman LLP. And Richard Zeifman, a PhD student at Ryerson. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, gentlemen. I really appreciate it. Fascinating.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for having us.
Good night, everybody.